The sun hit the corrugated metal rooftops of the Fulton Industrial District with a ferocity that turned the entire landscape into a shimmering mirage. Heat waves rose from the cracked asphalt, distorting the rows of abandoned warehouses that lined both sides of the access road. Lieutenant Sarah Collins adjusted her sunglasses and wiped a thin line of sweat from her temple as she stepped out of the unmarked patrol unit. The morning was barely 2 hours old, but Atlanta had already decided to remind everyone that summer was not letting go without a fight. Max landed beside her with the practiced grace of a seasoned operator, his paws hitting the ground in near silence despite his muscular frame. The Belgian Malinois immediately lifted his nose to the air, nostrils flaring as he catalogued the invisible symphony of scents that humans could never perceive. His ears rotated like satellite dishes, capturing sounds from blocks away. 7 years of partnership had taught Sarah to read every subtle shift in his posture, every twitch of his dark muzzle. Right now, Max was calm but alert, his intelligent brown eyes scanning the industrial wasteland with professional detachment. The call had come in as routine. A property management company conducting quarterly inspections had reported signs of unauthorized entry at Warehouse 14, one of a dozen structures they managed in this forgotten corner of the city. Broken padlock, disturbed dust patterns, the usual indicators that someone had been using the space for purposes the owners had not authorized, most likely homeless individuals seeking shelter or teenagers looking for a place to party away from adult supervision. Either way, it required documentation and clearance before the property company could proceed with their assessment. Sarah clipped the Bodycam to her tactical vest and activated it with a practiced motion. The small device emitted a brief vibration, confirming it was recording. Departmental policy required continuous documentation during any building entry, and Sarah had never been one to cut corners on procedure. The footage would sit on the servers for 90 days before automatic archival, rarely viewed unless an incident required review, just another layer of accountability in modern policing. Warehouse 14 loomed ahead, a massive structure of rust-streaked metal and faded signage. The words Mitchell Industrial Supply were barely visible beneath decades of weathering, a ghost of whatever enterprise had once thrived here. The loading dock doors were sealed with chains, but a personnel entrance on the eastern side showed the damage the property company had reported. The padlock lay on the ground, its shackle cut clean through with bolt cutters. Sarah unholstered her service weapon and held it at low ready. Beside her, Max shifted into working mode without command, his playful demeanor vanishing like morning mist. His body lowered slightly, muscles coiling with potential energy, eyes fixed on the dark rectangle of the open doorway. They had done this hundreds of times, the choreography of entry so ingrained it required no conscious thought. She pushed the door open with her boot and let the sunlight spill into the darkness beyond. Dust motes swirled in the golden beam like disturbed spirits. The interior smelled of rust, old oil, and something else that Max immediately locked onto. His head swiveled to the left, tracking an invisible trail that only he could perceive. Sarah gave him the command with a subtle hand gesture, and Max moved forward into the shadows. She followed 3 paces behind, weapon up, eyes adjusting to the diminished light. The warehouse interior was a maze of abandoned shelving units and scattered debris. Broken pallets formed wooden skeletons across the concrete floor. Somewhere in the distance, pigeons cooed from the rafters, disturbed by the intrusion. Max worked methodically, his nose sweeping back and forth like a metal detector. He cleared the first section of the warehouse, then the second, finding nothing of interest. Sarah began to relax slightly. This was looking more and more like a routine clearance, another false alarm in a city full of them. She was already mentally composing the brief report she would file when they returned to the precinct. Then Max stopped. The Malinois stood rigid before a section of wall that looked identical to every other wall in the building. Corrugated metal panels bolted to a steel frame, decades of accumulated grime creating abstract patterns across the surface. There was nothing visually remarkable about it, nothing that would draw human attention. But Max was frozen in his alert posture, every fiber of his being focused on that unremarkable wall. Sarah approached slowly, her weapon still raised. She had learned long ago to trust her partner's instincts over her own perceptions. Max could detect things that existed beyond the realm of human senses, and when he indicated, there was always a reason. She examined the wall more closely. The bolts looked normal, the panels were properly aligned. But as she studied the seams, she noticed something that might have escaped casual observation. The dust pattern was wrong. Everywhere else in the warehouse, dust had accumulated in thick, undisturbed layers. Here, along the bottom edge of two panels, the dust showed subtle disruption. Something had moved recently. Something had disturbed the decades of settled particles. Max whined softly, his gaze never leaving the wall. His front paw lifted slightly, the gesture he used when he wanted to indicate without barking. Whatever he was detecting was behind that barrier, and his training told him to maintain silence during building searches. Sarah reached for her radio to call in backup and request a more thorough investigation. Her fingers had just touched the device when it crackled to life with an urgent transmission. Dispatch was calling all available units to a situation developing on the other side of the district. An armed robbery in progress at a convenience store, shots possibly fired, officers requesting immediate assistance. She looked at Max, then at the wall, then toward the exit where sunlight beckoned. Protocol was clear. Active situations took priority over routine inspections. The wall would still be here when she returned. Whatever Max had detected was not going anywhere. She gave Max the command to disengage, and after a moment of hesitation that spoke to his professional disagreement with the decision, the Malinois followed her toward the door. Sarah made a mental note to request a follow-up investigation as soon as the active call was resolved. The bodycam had captured everything, and she would make sure the suspicious wall was properly documented in her report. They emerged into the blazing sunlight and sprinted to the patrol unit. Within seconds, they were racing toward the convenience store, sirens wailing, the mysterious warehouse already fading in the rearview mirror. The robbery turned out to be a misunderstanding. A customer had reached into his jacket for his wallet, and a nervous clerk had interpreted the motion as a weapon draw. By the time Sarah and Max arrived, the situation had been resolved. The embarrassed customer was receiving apologies, and the clerk was being counseled on proper threat assessment. Sarah spent the next 2 hours on administrative tasks related to the false alarm, and by the time she remembered the warehouse, the day had slipped away. She filed her report the following morning, noting the suspicious wall and Max's alert, recommending a follow-up investigation with proper equipment to examine what might lie behind the panels. The report went into the system. The bodycam footage was uploaded to the department servers, and Sarah moved on to the next call. The next case, the next demand on her attention. In a city as busy as Atlanta, there was always something new requiring immediate focus. The warehouse faded into the background noise of accumulated cases and pending investigations. 3 weeks later, everything changed. Marcus Webb had worked in the Atlanta Police Department's Digital Evidence Unit for 11 years. His official title was Senior Systems Analyst, but his colleagues simply called him the Librarian. He managed the vast archive of digital evidence that flowed through the department every day, from bodycam footage to surveillance recordings to forensic data extractions. His domain was a climate-controlled room in the basement of the central precinct. Filled with humming servers and blinking status lights, he knew every byte of data that entered his kingdom, and he took personal pride in the integrity of the archive. The quarterly audit was a tedious but necessary task. Marcus ran automated scripts that checked file integrity, verified storage allocation, and flagged any anomalies in the system. Most quarters, the audit completed without incident. The servers were well maintained, the backup protocols were robust, and the data remained secure. But this quarter, something was different. The script flagged a gap in the sequential file numbering for Bodycam uploads from 3 weeks prior. Every Bodycam in the department generated footage with a unique identifier, a string of numbers and letters that allowed the system to track every second of recorded material. The identifiers were sequential, assigned automatically when footage was uploaded. A gap in the sequence meant that something was missing. Marcus pulled up the logs and began tracing the anomaly. The missing identifier belonged to Lieutenant Collins, assigned to a routine warehouse inspection on the morning in question. According to the upload logs, the footage had been received by the server and stored in the appropriate archive. But the file itself was gone. Not corrupted, not moved, not accidentally overwritten. Gone. Deleted. He checked the deletion logs, expecting to find a routine purge or a maintenance error. What he found instead made him sit back in his chair and stare at the screen for a long moment. The file had been manually deleted by a user with administrative privileges. The deletion had been executed at 2:17 in the morning, 9 days after the original upload, and the user account that performed the deletion belonged to someone who should have had no reason to access that specific file. Marcus was not a detective, but he had worked in evidence management long enough to recognize when something was wrong. Manual deletions of Bodycam footage were serious matters, subject to strict protocols and multiple layers of approval. This deletion had bypassed all of those safeguards. Someone had accessed the system in the middle of the night and erased a specific piece of evidence, leaving no official record of why. He could have reported the anomaly through normal channels. That would have been the safe choice, the bureaucratically correct approach. But Marcus had known Sarah Collins for years. They had worked together on numerous cases, and he respected her dedication to proper procedure. If her footage had been deliberately deleted, she deserved to know about it directly. He found her in the K-9 unit's training facility, working with Max on scent discrimination exercises. The Malinois was weaving through a series of containers, his nose identifying the one that held the target odor while ignoring the distractors. Sarah watched with the focused attention of a proud partner, occasionally offering quiet words of encouragement. Marcus waited until the exercise concluded before approaching. He did not want to interrupt their work, and he needed a private moment to share what he had discovered. Sarah looked up as he approached, recognizing his expression immediately. In 11 years of working together, she had learned to read his subtle cues. Something was bothering him, something serious enough to bring him away from his beloved servers. He explained the situation in careful technical terms: the audit, the gap, the deletion, the timestamp, the user account. He showed her the logs on his tablet, walking her through the evidence that something improper had occurred. By the time he finished, Sarah's expression had shifted from curiosity to concern to something harder, something that looked like determination. She remembered the warehouse. She remembered Max's alert, the suspicious wall, the dust patterns that suggested recent movement. At the time, she had assumed her follow-up recommendation would trigger a proper investigation. Now she understood why that investigation had never materialized. Someone had made sure the evidence of what Max had found never saw the light of day. The question was who and why. She asked Marcus to keep the discovery between them for now. If someone inside the department had the access and motivation to delete Bodycam footage, that person might also have the ability to monitor internal communications. Until she understood what she was dealing with, Sarah wanted to keep her investigation off the official radar. Marcus agreed reluctantly. His instinct was to escalate immediately, to follow the proper chain of command and let the Internal Affairs Division handle the matter. But he trusted Sarah's judgment, and he understood her caution. Someone with administrative access to the evidence servers was involved in this, and that narrowed the pool of suspects to a small and concerning group. After Marcus returned to his basement domain, Sarah sat with Max in the quiet of the training facility and considered her options. The Malinois rested his head on her knee, sensing her tension but offering silent comfort through his presence. 7 years together had created a bond that transcended words, a connection built on mutual trust and shared experience. The warehouse was the starting point. Whatever Max had detected behind that wall was important enough that someone had gone to considerable lengths to erase the evidence of his discovery. That meant returning to the warehouse and finding out what was hidden there. But this time, Sarah would not be caught off guard, and she would not leave without answers. She waited until her next scheduled day off, 3 days later. The delay was difficult, but necessary. Whoever had deleted the footage might be monitoring her activities, and any deviation from routine could alert them to her suspicions. She needed to approach this carefully, like a chess player thinking several moves ahead. The morning dawned clear and warm, another scorching Atlanta day in the making. Sarah dressed in civilian clothes and loaded Max into her personal vehicle, a practical SUV that attracted no attention in the residential neighborhood where she lived. They drove toward the industrial district through surface streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where patrol units might recognize her. Warehouse 14 looked exactly as she remembered it. The same rust-streaked walls, the same faded signage, the same chain-sealed loading docks. The personnel door had been secured with a new padlock since her last visit, but Sarah had come prepared. Her lock-picking skills were not officially part of her training, but years of working various assignments had provided opportunities to learn useful techniques. The new padlock yielded after 2 minutes of patient work. She pushed the door open and let Max enter first, his nose already working the stale air. The interior was unchanged, the same maze of abandoned shelving and scattered debris. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, creating patches of illumination amid the shadows. Max moved with purpose toward the wall he'd alerted on 3 weeks earlier. His memory was as sharp as his senses, and he guided Sarah through the maze without hesitation. When they reached the suspicious section, he assumed his alert posture once again, confirming that whatever had triggered his response was still present. Sarah examined the wall more closely than she had been able to during her rushed first visit. The disturbed dust pattern was still visible, though somewhat obscured by new settling. She ran her fingers along the seams between the metal panels, feeling for any irregularity that might indicate a hidden mechanism. Near the bottom edge, she found it. A small lever concealed behind a loose bolt, positioned where it would be invisible to casual observation. She pulled the lever, and a section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges. The movement was smooth and silent, the mechanism well maintained, despite the apparent abandonment of the warehouse. Beyond the secret door, a tunnel stretched into darkness, its walls lined with rough concrete. The passage was wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, and tall enough that Sarah did not need to duck. Max's nose was working overtime, cataloging the scents that flowed from the tunnel. Sarah could see his excitement in the quiver of his muscles, the slight wag of his tail. He had found something significant, and he wanted to investigate further. She pulled out her flashlight and stepped into the tunnel, Max at her side. The air was cooler here, insulated from the Georgia heat by the surrounding earth. The passage sloped gently downward, leading away from the warehouse toward some unknown destination. Sarah counted her paces as she walked, estimating distance and direction. After approximately 200 meters, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. What she found there made her stop and stare. The chamber was a fully equipped facility, obviously active and well-maintained. Fluorescent lights hung from the ceiling, Currently off, but showing no signs of age or neglect. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with electronic equipment. Boxes were stacked in neat rows, their labels indicating various types of consumer electronics. Smartphones, tablets, laptop computers, wireless earbuds. Brand names that she recognized, packaging that looked completely legitimate, except it was not legitimate. Sarah picked up one of the boxes and examined it closely. The printing was slightly off, the colors not quite matching the authentic products she had seen in stores. The security seals were present, but subtly different. The holograms good, but not perfect. These were counterfeits, high-quality fakes designed to fool casual consumers. She moved through the chamber, documenting everything with her personal phone. The scale of the operation was impressive. Thousands of counterfeit devices in various stages of completion. Assembly equipment, packaging materials, shipping labels. This was not a small-time operation. Someone had invested significant resources in creating a professional counterfeiting facility, hidden beneath the streets of Atlanta in a tunnel that should not exist. Max alerted near one of the workbenches, drawing her attention to a stack of paperwork partially hidden beneath a box of fake phone chargers. Sarah pulled out the papers and scanned their contents. Shipping manifests, inventory lists, contact information. Most of it was coded or abbreviated, but a few entries were clear enough to understand. The operation was distributing counterfeits through multiple channels, using legitimate shipping companies to move fake products to retailers across the Southeast. One document caught her attention. A schedule of some kind with dates and times and what looked like badge numbers, police badge numbers. Sarah felt a chill despite the cool air of the underground chamber. The counterfeiting operation had someone inside the department, someone providing information about patrol schedules and investigation priorities. Someone who knew when this warehouse would be inspected and could arrange for the evidence of discovery to disappear. She photographed every document, every box, every piece of equipment. The evidence on her phone would not be as legally admissible as official documentation, but it would be enough to justify a proper investigation by people she could trust. The question was finding those people. A sound from the tunnel made both Sarah and Max freeze. Footsteps, distant but approaching. Someone else was in the passage coming toward the chamber. Sarah killed her flashlight and moved to a position behind the stacked boxes, pulling Max close beside her. In the darkness, they waited. Two figures emerged from the tunnel, their own flashlights casting dancing beams across the walls. They were talking in low voices, their words becoming clearer as they approached. The first voice was unfamiliar, male, with a slight accent that Sarah could not place. He was complaining about the heat outside, about the difficulty of maintaining the tunnel entrance, about the need for better ventilation in the underground facility. Normal complaints, the kind of mundane observations that workers everywhere made about their environments. The second voice stopped Sarah's breath in her throat. She knew that voice. She had heard it in briefings, in meetings, in casual conversations around the precinct. It belonged to Lieutenant David Chen, a 15-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department and the current supervisor of the Digital Evidence Unit, Marcus Webb's direct superior. Chen was discussing the timeline for the next shipment, the need to move product before the end of the month, the importance of maintaining cover. His tone was businesslike, professional, utterly devoid of the ethical conflict that should accompany such a conversation. He spoke about the counterfeiting operation the way he might discuss any administrative matter, with efficient detachment. The two men moved to a workbench near the center of the chamber and began examining some of the equipment. Chen picked up a counterfeit smartphone and inspected it with apparent satisfaction. He mentioned that the latest batch was their best work yet, that the authentication markers were nearly indistinguishable from genuine products. His companion agreed, adding that their distribution network was ready to handle increased volume. Sarah listened from her hiding spot. Her mind racing through implications and possibilities. Chen was the one who had deleted the bodycam footage. He had the access, the knowledge, and now, clearly, the motivation. His position in the digital evidence unit gave him the perfect cover for manipulating the department's records. He could see what evidence was being collected when investigations were getting close and take action to protect the operation. But how deep did this go? Was Chen acting alone, or were others involved? The badge numbers on the documents suggested multiple officers might be compromised. The scale of the operation indicated significant financial resources and organizational capability. This was not a case of one corrupt cop supplementing his income. This was something larger, more organized, more dangerous. Max shifted beside her, his body tense with the effort of remaining still. The Malinois was trained to wait for commands, but his instincts were screaming at him to act. He could sense the wrongness of the situation, could detect the elevated heart rates and stress hormones of the men across the chamber. His partner was in potential danger, and every fiber of his being wanted to protect her. Sarah placed a calming hand on his flank, silently urging patience. They were outnumbered, in an unfamiliar environment, without backup or official support. Confrontation now would be foolish. Better to gather what intelligence they could and retreat to plan a proper response. The conversation across the chamber shifted to the topic of the bodycam deletion. Chen mentioned that he was confident the matter was contained, that the footage was permanently erased and no copies existed. His companion asked about the officer who had made the original recording, whether she posed a threat to the operation. Chen's response chilled Sarah to her core. He said that Lieutenant Collins was a good cop, but not a threat. She had filed her report and moved on just like everyone else. The follow-up investigation she requested had been quietly buried in the bureaucratic system, marked as low priority and assigned to an overworked detective who would never get around to it. The warehouse was secure, the tunnel was safe, and the operation would continue as planned. He was wrong about her moving on, but he did not know that yet. The two men completed their inspection and headed back toward the tunnel, their flashlights receding into the darkness. Sarah waited a full 5 minutes after the footsteps faded before moving from her position. She and Max made their way back through the tunnel, through the hidden door, and out of the warehouse into the blazing afternoon sun. Sitting in her SUV with Max panting softly in the back seat, Sarah considered her next move. She had evidence of the operation on her phone, knowledge of at least one corrupt officer, and a timeline suggesting imminent activity, but she could not simply walk into the precinct and report what she had found. Chen had access to the department's systems, probably monitored internal communications, and might have allies she did not yet know about. Going through official channels could tip him off and give him time to destroy evidence or disappear. She needed someone she could trust absolutely, someone outside Chen's sphere of influence, someone with the authority to act on what she had discovered. The list of candidates was short. Captain Angela Morrison had been Sarah's mentor when she first joined the force, a tough and principled officer who had risen through the ranks on merit and integrity. She now commanded the Major Crimes Division, a unit that operated with significant independence from the regular departmental structure. More importantly, she had a reputation for protecting honest cops and pursuing corrupt ones with equal vigor. If anyone could be trusted with this information, it was Morrison. Sarah drove to the captain's home, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood on the eastern edge of the city. She did not call ahead, did not risk any communication that might be monitored. She simply appeared on the doorstep with Max and asked for a few minutes of Morrison's time. The captain listened without interruption as Sarah laid out everything she had discovered. The audit finding, the deleted footage, the warehouse, the tunnel, the counterfeiting operation. Chen's involvement. She showed the photographs on her phone, the documents she had captured, the evidence of police badge numbers connected to the criminal enterprise. When Sarah finished, Morrison sat in silence for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she began to ask questions, precise, probing questions that demonstrated her years of investigative experience. She wanted to know about the timeline, the security measures at the warehouse, the apparent scale of the operation, the likelihood of other officers being involved. Sarah answered as completely as she could, acknowledging the gaps in her knowledge, the assumptions she had made, the risks she had taken by investigating without authorization. Morrison's assessment was sobering but supportive. Sarah had uncovered something significant, but she had also put herself in a vulnerable position. Investigating a fellow officer without official sanction was a serious breach of protocol, one that could end careers even when the target turned out to be guilty. Chen's position in the digital evidence unit made him especially dangerous. He could potentially manipulate records to make Sarah look like the corrupt one, could plant evidence, could destroy her reputation before she had a chance to defend herself. The solution, Morrison decided, was to bring in outside resources. The FBI had a public corruption task force that operated independently of local law enforcement. They had their own evidence systems, their own chain of custody, their own ability to investigate without tipping off compromised officers. Morrison had contacts in that task force, people she trusted from previous joint operations. She would reach out to them quietly and arrange a proper investigation. In the meantime, Sarah needed to continue her normal routine and avoid any action that might alert Chen to her suspicions. The counterfeiting operation was apparently planning a major shipment before the end of the month. If they could time the takedown properly, they could catch everyone involved in the act, with evidence that would be impossible to explain away. Sarah agreed to the plan, though the waiting chafed against her instincts. She wanted to act now, to confront Chen, to shut down the operation before any more counterfeit products reached consumers. But she understood the strategic necessity of patience. A rushed action could let the bigger players escape, could leave the corruption network partially intact, could result in compromised prosecutions that put guilty people back on the street. She returned to work the next day and forced herself to behave normally. She handled her regular caseload, conducted routine patrols, trained with Max as if nothing unusual had occurred. When she passed Chen in the hallway, she offered the same professional nod she always had. If he noticed anything different in her demeanor, he gave no indication. The following week was an exercise in controlled tension. Sarah went through the motions of her daily responsibilities while her mind constantly circled back to the warehouse, the tunnel, the chamber full of counterfeit electronics. She found herself studying her colleagues with new suspicion, wondering which of them might be connected to the operation. The badge numbers on those documents haunted her. How many officers in this building were betraying their oaths for a share of counterfeiting profits? Max seemed to sense her tension. The Malinois stayed closer to her than usual during shifts, his presence a constant comfort. During their downtime, he would rest his head on her leg and gaze up at her with those intelligent brown eyes, offering silent support. Their bond had always been strong, but the pressure of the secret investigation deepened it further. He was the one partner she could trust completely, the one ally whose loyalty was beyond question. Morrison contacted her on the 8th day with news. The FBI task force was on board. They had reviewed the evidence Sarah had gathered and agreed that a full investigation was warranted. Agents would be arriving in Atlanta within the week to begin coordinating the operation. Until then, Sarah's orders remained unchanged. Maintain normal routine, avoid alerting the targets, wait. The waiting ended sooner than expected. Sarah was working a routine patrol in the downtown district when her radio crackled with an urgent message. All available units were being called to the Fulton Industrial District. Reports of gunfire, multiple shooters, possible officer involved. The address given was 4 blocks from Warehouse 14. She responded immediately, lights and sirens carrying her through traffic toward the scene. Max stood alert in the back seat, recognizing the shift in energy that accompanied emergency response. By the time they arrived, the scene was already chaotic. Multiple patrol units, ambulances, fire trucks, officers taking cover behind vehicles, weapons drawn, focused on a building that Sarah did not immediately recognize. The briefing was fragmented, delivered in hurried bursts between radio transmissions. Someone had discovered the counterfeiting operation. A patrol officer had noticed unusual activity at a neighboring warehouse and investigated. He had stumbled onto armed individuals loading boxes into a truck. Shots had been exchanged. The officer was down, possibly wounded, position unknown. The shooters had retreated into the building, taking up defensive positions. Sarah's heart sank as she absorbed the information. The operation had been blown, not by careful FBI planning, but by random chance. A patrol officer in the wrong place at the wrong time had triggered exactly the kind of chaotic confrontation that Morrison had wanted to avoid. Now, there was a wounded colleague somewhere in that building, armed criminals prepared to fight, and a counterfeiting ring that would surely destroy evidence at the first opportunity. She pushed through the perimeter and found the incident commander, a sergeant named Walsh, who was clearly struggling to manage the rapidly evolving situation. He briefed her on what they knew. The wounded officer was Ramirez, a young patrolman with 3 years on the force. He had managed to radio for help before going silent. His last transmission indicated he was hit but mobile, trying to find cover inside the building. No contact since. The shooters numbered at least 4, possibly more. They had automatic weapons, a significant upgrade from the usual criminal arsenal. Tactical units were en route, but at least 15 minutes out. In the meantime, they were holding a perimeter and trying to establish communication with the subjects inside. Sarah looked at Max, then at the building. Ramirez was in there, wounded and alone. Every minute that passed reduced his chances of survival. The tactical teams might arrive in time to save him, or they might not. Someone needed to go in now. She made her decision without consulting Walsh. Max was a trained tracking dog, capable of locating Ramirez by scent in a way that human searchers could not match. She had worked active shooter situations before, knew how to move through hostile environments, understood the risks she would be taking. The only question was whether she was willing to accept those risks. She was. Walsh protested, but Sarah was already moving. She gave Max the command to search, offering him a piece of fabric from Ramirez's patrol unit that carried his scent. The Malinois inhaled deeply, locking onto the target odor, and began leading her toward a side entrance that the shooters did not appear to be covering. They entered the building through a broken window, moving low and quiet. The interior was another abandoned warehouse, similar in layout to the dozens of others in the district. Sarah could hear distant shouting, the crash of equipment being moved, the sounds of people preparing for either defense or escape. The shooters were focused on the main entrance, expecting the police response to come from that direction. They had not anticipated a flanking approach. Max led her through the maze of old machinery and collapsed shelving, his nose never wavering from Ramirez's trail. They found him behind an overturned forklift, conscious but bleeding from a wound in his thigh. The young officer looked up with relief, and fear mingled in his eyes. He had been certain he was going to die in this building, alone and forgotten. Sarah assessed his wound quickly. The bullet had gone through clean, missing the major arteries. He would survive if they could get him out and to medical care. The question was how to accomplish that extraction with armed hostiles between them and the exit. She keyed her radio and reported her position, her status, and Ramirez's condition. Walsh acknowledged with obvious relief. He informed her that tactical units were now 5 minutes out. If she could hold position, they would be able to coordinate a proper extraction. 5 minutes. It seemed both endless and impossibly brief. Sarah positioned herself to cover the approach to their hiding spot, weapon ready, while Max stood guard beside Ramirez. The young officer was trying to stay quiet, but pain made his breathing ragged and loud. Every sound seemed magnified in the echoing warehouse. The shooters were moving. Sarah could hear them arguing in rapid exchanges she could not quite make out. They seemed to be debating whether to stand and fight or attempt to escape through some alternative route. The police perimeter made conventional escape impossible. But Sarah remembered the tunnel beneath Warehouse 14. These criminals almost certainly knew about that tunnel. They might be planning to use it. She could not let that happen. If they escaped through the tunnel, they would disappear into the underground network and might never be found. More importantly, they would take whatever evidence remained of the operation, making prosecution difficult or impossible. Chen and whoever else was involved in the police corruption would survive to corrupt another day. A new voice joined the argument in the distance. A voice Sarah recognized, though she had never expected to hear it in this context. Lieutenant Chen was in the building, shouting orders at the shooters, demanding they hold position while he dealt with something. His tone was panicked, desperate, utterly unlike the calm professional she had known in the precinct. The situation had just become significantly more complicated. Sarah reported Chen's presence on a secondary channel, knowing that Walsh might not believe her, but needing to establish the record. An officer of Chen's rank involved with criminals would create serious procedural problems for the eventual prosecution. Everything needed to be documented, every action justified, every decision defensible. Walsh's response was skeptical but professional. He asked for confirmation, for details. Sarah provided what she could while keeping her voice low enough not to attract attention. She described Chen's interaction with the shooters, his apparent authority over them, his obvious familiarity with the operation. The radio fell silent for a moment. Then Morrison's voice came through, crisp and commanding. She had arrived at the scene and was taking over incident command. She confirmed that Sarah's information was consistent with their ongoing investigation, that Chen had been identified as a person of interest, that his presence at the scene changed the tactical calculus significantly. New orders came down: hold position, protect Ramirez, wait for tactical. Under no circumstances engage Chen directly. The FBI was now fully involved, and they wanted the lieutenant taken alive if possible. His knowledge of the corruption network was too valuable to risk in a shooting confrontation. Sarah acknowledged the orders while silently calculating her options. She would obey if she could. But if Chen or the shooters discovered her position, if they threatened Ramirez, if waiting meant watching a wounded colleague die, then orders would have to yield to necessity. Max was tracking something new. His ears had rotated toward a section of the warehouse that Sarah had not yet examined. His nose twitched, processing scent information that humans could not perceive. After a moment, he looked at Sarah with the expression she had come to recognize as a warning. Someone was approaching their position, moving quietly, trying not to be detected. She shifted her stance, weapon oriented toward the threat. Beside her, Ramirez fumbled for his own gun, his hands shaking from blood loss, but his determination undiminished. They would not go down without a fight. The figure that emerged from the shadows was not what she expected. It was a woman, middle-aged, wearing civilian clothes, stained with what looked like machine oil. Her hands were raised, her expression terrified. She whispered urgently, identifying herself as a worker in the counterfeiting operation. She was not a criminal, she insisted. She was a victim. She had been forced to work in the tunnel facility under threat of violence against her family. She wanted to help, wanted to escape, wanted to do anything necessary to end this nightmare. Sarah assessed her quickly. The woman appeared unarmed and genuinely frightened. Her story was plausible, though impossible to verify in the moment. Taking her at face value was a risk, but leaving her wandering the building was a greater one. She could inadvertently reveal Sarah's position, could be used as a hostage, could become another casualty in a situation that already had too many potential victims. The woman's name was Eleanor. She had been recruited 6 months ago, offered what seemed like a legitimate job assembling electronics. By the time she understood what she was actually doing, it was too late. The people running the operation had made clear that anyone who tried to leave would face severe consequences. She had kept working, kept her head down, kept praying for some opportunity to escape. Today's chaos was that opportunity. When the shooting started, Eleanor had hidden in a storage closet. She had stayed there until she heard Sarah moving through the building, realized it was a police officer, and decided to take her chance. Sarah made a command decision. She told Eleanor to stay with Ramirez, to keep pressure on his wound, to stay quiet and hidden. Then she gave Max a new command, directing him to guard the position while she moved to gather intelligence. The Malinois understood immediately. He positioned himself between the civilians and the direction of potential threat, his body low and ready to spring at any hostile approach. His loyalty was to Sarah, but his training allowed him to extend protection to those she designated as requiring it. Sarah moved through the warehouse, using the cover of abandoned equipment to approach the area where she had heard Chen and the shooters. She needed to understand the layout, identify the exits, locate the threats. The tactical team would be arriving soon, and any information she could provide would improve their chances of resolving this without further casualties. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Chen was coordinating an evacuation, not of the warehouse, but of the underground facility. The shooters were buying time, while other members of the operation destroyed evidence and prepared to escape through the tunnel. The whole confrontation at this warehouse was a distraction, a way to keep police attention focused while the real operation slipped away beneath their feet. She reported this on the secondary channel, hoping Morrison would hear and understand. The warehouse was not the primary target. The tunnel was. If they wanted to catch the leaders of the counterfeiting ring, they needed to seal the tunnel exits before the evacuation could complete. Morrison acknowledged with a curt affirmative. She was already repositioning units, sealing the industrial district, calling for additional resources. But she needed time, and time was the one thing they did not have. Sarah made another command decision. She could not stop the evacuation alone, but she could slow it down. She could create enough chaos and confusion to buy Morrison the minutes she needed. It was dangerous, possibly foolish, almost certainly a violation of the orders she had been given. But Ramirez was bleeding behind that forklift. Evidence was being destroyed beneath her feet, and corrupt officers were about to escape justice. Some situations demanded action over caution. She found a fire alarm panel near the warehouse's original office section. The system was old, but still connected to the building's decrepit sprinkler network. She triggered the alarm, and immediately water began cascading from ceiling fixtures throughout the structure. The ancient pipes groaned and shuddered, adding their own chaos to the situation. The effect was immediate. The shooters began shouting in confusion, unable to hear each other over the alarm's piercing wail. The water obscured visibility, created puddles that made movement treacherous, soaked weapons and equipment. Chen's voice rose above the chaos, screaming orders that no one could follow. Sarah moved through the confusion like a ghost, using the chaos she had created as cover. She reached the area where Elena had indicated the tunnel entrance was located and found 2 men trying to secure a heavy steel door against the water flooding the floor. They were focused on their task, their weapons holstered, their attention on the mechanical challenge rather than their surroundings. She announced herself with weapon drawn, ordering them to the ground. One complied immediately, dropping flat with hands behind his head. The other hesitated, calculating his chances, then slowly reached for the gun at his hip. Max appeared from nowhere, 80 pounds of trained protection dog, hitting the man's arm before his fingers could close on the weapon. The impact spun him sideways, and Max maintained his grip, controlling the threat without mauling, exactly as he had been trained. Sarah moved in to secure the weapon while the man screamed about his arm, about police brutality, about lawsuits and lawyers and rights he was suddenly very concerned with protecting. She secured both men with zip ties and keyed her radio with an update. 2 subjects in custody, tunnel entrance located, requesting immediate backup. Morrison responded that tactical units were entering the building now, that the perimeter was secure, that additional tunnel exits had been identified and sealed. The trap was closing. The next 20 minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. Tactical officers flooded the warehouse, securing shooters one by one. Chen was found trying to escape through a basement window, his dignity as a police officer abandoned along with his duty weapon. He offered no resistance when confronted, merely stood with slumped shoulders while officers he had once commanded placed him in handcuffs. Ramirez was evacuated to a waiting ambulance, conscious and stable, his wounds serious but not life-threatening. The young officer managed a weak thumbs up as the paramedics loaded him, his gratitude for Sarah's intervention evident despite his pain. Eleanor was taken into protective custody, her cooperation already beginning to yield valuable intelligence about the operation's structure. She knew names, addresses, shipping routes, financial connections. The counterfeiting ring was far larger than anyone had suspected, extending beyond Atlanta into multiple states, involving legitimate businesses as well as criminal enterprises. The FBI agents who had arrived during the confrontation were practically salivating at the scope of the case that was developing. By the time the scene was secured, afternoon had surrendered to evening. Sarah sat on the tailgate of a fire department vehicle, Max lying exhausted at her feet, while emergency lights painted the industrial district in alternating red and blue. Her uniform was soaked, her muscles ached, and her mind was still processing everything that had happened. The investigation that had started with a routine warehouse inspection had ended with a major criminal takedown and the exposure of corruption within her own department. Morrison found her there and sat down beside her without speaking. The captain looked as tired as Sarah felt, the weight of the day's events visible in every line of her face. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the activity around them with the detachment of veterans who had seen too much to be overwhelmed by any single event. Finally, Morrison spoke. She commended Sarah's actions, both her initial investigation and her performance during the crisis. The rules had been bent, protocols had been bypassed, orders had been interpreted creatively. In other circumstances, there might have been consequences, but the outcome spoke for itself. A major criminal operation dismantled, a corrupt officer exposed, evidence preserved, lives saved. Sometimes results justified methods. Sarah accepted the praise with characteristic modesty. She had done what needed to be done, nothing more. The credit belonged to the team, to Morrison's coordination, to the tactical officers who had executed the building clearance, to the FBI agents who would spend months building the prosecution, and to Max, always to Max, whose initial alert had started everything and whose faithful presence had supported her through every dangerous moment. The Malinois lifted his head at the sound of his name, tail wagging despite his exhaustion. Sarah reached down to scratch behind his ears, the familiar gesture of appreciation that he never tired of receiving. 7 years of partnership had created something irreplaceable between them, a bond that words could not adequately describe. He was not just a tool or a weapon or an asset. He was her partner, her friend, her constant companion through the best and worst moments of her career. The following weeks brought a cascade of developments. Chen's arrest triggered a broader investigation that identified 3 additional officers connected to the counterfeiting ring. All were suspended pending criminal charges. The FBI took over the prosecution, combining the Atlanta case with similar operations they had been tracking in other jurisdictions. The scope of the conspiracy exceeded initial estimates, involving millions of dollars in counterfeit goods and corrupting influences in multiple law enforcement agencies. Elena's cooperation proved invaluable. Her testimony would be central to prosecuting the ring's leadership, several of whom had fled the country but were being tracked through international channels. She was relocated to witness protection, given a new identity and a chance to rebuild the life that the criminals had exploited. Before she left, she found Sarah at the precinct and thanked her for the rescue, for believing her story, for giving her the chance to escape. It was a small moment amid the larger drama, but Sarah carried it with her as a reminder of why the work mattered. Marcus Webb received a commendation for his audit work that had first identified the deleted footage. His quiet diligence had set everything in motion. His willingness to bring concerns directly to Sarah rather than through bureaucratic channels had enabled the investigation to proceed without alerting the corrupt officers. He returned to his basement server room with characteristic modesty, more comfortable with machines than recognition. Ramirez recovered from his wound and returned to active duty after 6 weeks of rehabilitation. He made a point of visiting the K-9 unit on his first day back, kneeling to thank Max personally for the rescue. The Malinois accepted the attention with dignified tolerance, allowing the young officer to scratch his ears and murmur gratitude before returning to his bed for a nap. Heroes needed their rest, after all. Sarah found her own rhythm again as the weeks passed. The intensity of the investigation faded into memory, replaced by the routine demands of police work, traffic stops and domestic calls, suspicious persons and minor crimes. The ordinary texture of life in law enforcement, punctuated occasionally by moments of genuine importance. She thought sometimes about the sequence of events that had brought her to that warehouse 3 weeks before the crisis. A routine call, a broken padlock, an abandoned building that should have been empty. If Max had not alerted on that wall, she would never have noticed the hidden door. If she had not filed her report, Marcus would never have discovered the deleted footage. If the footage had not been deleted, she would never have investigated further. Each link in the chain was necessary, each moment building toward the resolution that followed. It reminded her why she had become a police officer in the first place. Not for the excitement, though there was certainly that. Not for the authority, though that came with the badge. But for moments like these, when persistence and courage and partnership combined to make a genuine difference. When criminals were brought to justice and innocent people were protected, and the thin blue line actually meant something. Max lay beside her desk as she completed the final paperwork on the case, his breathing slow and peaceful. His role in the investigation would be noted in the official record, another success added to an already impressive career. But the commendations and recognitions meant nothing to him. What mattered was the work itself, the partnership with Sarah, the simple satisfaction of doing what he had been trained to do. She reached down and rested her hand on his flank, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath the coarse fur. 7 years they had been together, and she could not imagine the job without him. He was more than a K-9 officer, more than a tool of law enforcement. He was the truest partner she had ever known, loyal beyond question, brave beyond measure, faithful through every trial. The sun was setting over Atlanta, painting the skyline in shades of gold and crimson. Another day ending, another shift concluding, another chapter in the endless story of a city and the people who protected it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The bodycam footage might have vanished from the server, But the truth it had captured could not be erased. Max's alert had started a chain of events that brought down a criminal empire and exposed corruption within the department itself. A single moment of K-9 instinct, preserved in memory if not in digital form, had changed everything. That was the nature of police work. You never knew which routine call would become something extraordinary, which ordinary moment would define a career. You showed up, did the job, trusted your training and your partner and your instincts, and sometimes, if you were lucky and skilled and brave, you made a difference that mattered. Sarah turned off her desk lamp and gathered her things. Max rose and stretched, ready to follow her wherever the next moment led. Together, they walked out of the precinct into the warm Atlanta evening, partners bound by duty and affection and 7 years of shared experience. The city spread before them, vast and complex and endlessly demanding. Somewhere in its sprawling expanse, crimes were being committed and justice was being sought, and ordinary people were living their lives in the hope that someone would protect them when protection was needed. Sarah and Max would be there when the call came. They always were. The night shift was beginning, patrol units rolling out into the streets, dispatchers coordinating the endless dance of law enforcement across a metropolis that never truly slept. Sarah loaded Max into her personal vehicle, off duty now but never truly off call. The job followed you home, lived in your thoughts, shaped your dreams. It was not a career so much as an identity, a commitment that defined everything else. She drove through familiar streets, past landmarks she had known since childhood. Atlanta was her city, her responsibility, her home. Every corner held memories, cases she had worked, moments that had tested her. The warehouse district faded in her rearview mirror, but its lessons remained fresh. Trust your partner. Question authority when authority deserves questioning. Never assume that routine will remain routine. Max settled into his traveling spot, nose pressed against the window, watching the city scroll past with the alert curiosity that never seemed to fade despite his years. His reflection ghosted across the glass, a faithful shadow accompanying her through the urban landscape. Home was a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, comfortable rather than luxurious. Sarah had never cared much for possessions, preferring to invest her resources in experiences and relationships rather than things. The house was clean, functional, a place to rest between the demands of duty. She let Max into the backyard and watched him explore his territory, checking the perimeter with professional thoroughness before settling into his favorite spot beneath the old oak tree. Even off-duty, his instincts never fully relaxed. He was always watching, always ready, always prepared to spring into action if circumstances demanded. Sarah sat on the back porch with a glass of water and let the tension of the past weeks slowly drain away. The stars were emerging overhead, faint pinpoints struggling against the city's light pollution, but visible nonetheless. The same stars that had watched over Atlanta since before the city existed, indifferent to the human dramas playing out beneath their ancient gaze. She thought about the case, about Chen and his corruption, about the counterfeiting ring and its reach. The investigation would continue for months, possibly years. Trials would be held, sentences would be delivered, appeals would be filed. The legal process would grind forward with its own momentum, transforming the chaos of the warehouse confrontation into the ordered formality of courtrooms and documents. But for Sarah, the important work was done. She had discovered the truth, had acted on it despite the risks, had seen justice begun if not completed. That was all any officer could really do. Plant the seeds and trust that others would nurture them to harvest. Max appeared at her side, having completed his patrol of the backyard. He settled at her feet with a contented sigh, his duty done, his territory secure. Sarah reached down to stroke his head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, another shift, another set of calls, another opportunity to serve the city she loved. But tonight, she could rest. Tonight, she could appreciate the simple pleasure of sitting in her own backyard with her faithful partner, watching the stars emerge and listening to the distant sounds of a city settling into night. The Bodycam footage had vanished from the server, erased by a corrupt officer trying to protect a criminal enterprise. But the evidence it had captured lived on in Sarah's memory, in Max's instincts, in the chain of events that had followed its deletion. Technology could be manipulated, records could be altered, but truth had a way of emerging despite every effort to suppress it. That was the lesson she took from the whole experience. Truth was resilient, justice was persistent, and partnership, real partnership, was the most powerful force in law enforcement. She finished her water and stood, calling Max to follow her inside. The house was quiet, peaceful, a sanctuary from the chaos of the streets. She went through her evening routine with mechanical efficiency, the habits of years guiding her movements without conscious thought. Max ate his dinner and retreated to his bed in the corner of her bedroom, circling 3 times before settling into position. It was a ritual as old as dogs themselves, a comfort behavior that spoke to instincts far deeper than training. Sarah smiled at the familiar sight, grateful for the constancy of his presence. She lay in bed and let sleep approach on its own schedule. The case was closed, the criminals were arrested, the department was healing from the wound of corruption. There would be aftershocks, certainly. Morale issues, trust deficits, and procedural reviews. But the essential work had been done. The bad actors had been identified and removed. The system, imperfect as it was, had proven capable of policing itself. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of the warehouse, of Max's alert, of the moment when everything had changed. A routine inspection that became an investigation, that became a crisis, that became a resolution. The unpredictable arc of police work compressed into a few weeks of intensity. Tomorrow, she would start again. New cases, new challenges, new opportunities. The city never stopped generating demands, and she never stopped answering them. That was the contract she had made when she pinned on the badge, the promise she renewed every time she reported for duty. Max was snoring softly from his bed, the peaceful sounds of a working dog at rest. Sarah listened to that familiar rhythm and let it carry her into sleep. In her dreams, she was back in the warehouse, moving through the shadows with Max at her side. But in the dream, there was no danger, no confrontation, no crisis, just the two of them, partners exploring an unknown space, trusting each other completely. The dream faded into deeper sleep, and Sarah rested, gathering strength for whatever tomorrow would bring. The city of Atlanta continued its endless cycle around her. Crimes committed and solved, lives begun and ended, the eternal rhythm of urban existence. Somewhere a siren wailed, somewhere an officer responded, somewhere justice was being served or denied or delayed. And in a quiet house, in a quiet neighborhood, a lieutenant and her K-9 partner slept, ready to answer when duty called again. The morning came with golden light streaming through bedroom windows and Max's cold nose pressing against her hand. Sarah woke to find him standing beside the bed, tail wagging, ready for whatever the new day would bring. She laughed and rubbed his ears, accepting the enthusiastic greeting that never varied, regardless of how long she had been asleep. A new day, a new opportunity, a new chance to make a difference. She rose and prepared for duty, the familiar routine comforting in its predictability. Uniform pressed, equipment checked, badge polished. Max watched her preparations with patient attention, understanding that these rituals preceded the activity he loved best. Work was coming, and work was what gave his life meaning. They drove to the precinct together, the morning commute a time for quiet contemplation. Sarah reviewed her mental list of pending matters, ongoing cases, administrative obligations. The Chen investigation was in federal hands now, but there would be questions, depositions, testimony. Her role was not complete, merely transitioning from investigator to witness. The K-9 unit was already active when she arrived, handlers and dogs preparing for the day's assignments. Max greeted his K-9 colleagues with the professional respect of working partners, exchanging brief sniffs before settling into his designated space. The social dynamics of the unit were complex, hierarchies established through subtle signals that humans could only partially perceive. Sarah checked in with her supervisor, received her assignments, reviewed the overnight incident reports. The city had been relatively quiet, the usual mix of minor crimes and false alarms, nothing requiring her specific attention, nothing that could not be handled through normal channels. She was about to head out for patrol when Morrison appeared at the unit's entrance. The captain's expression was serious but not grim, suggesting news of significance but not crisis. They stepped into a private office, Max waiting patiently outside. Morrison reported that the FBI had made additional arrests overnight, including 2 suspects who had fled the country but were intercepted at a Canadian border crossing. The counterfeiting ring's leadership was now almost entirely in custody, with only minor figures remaining at large. More importantly, the internal investigation had cleared all other officers in the department of involvement. Chen and his 3 co-conspirators had been the only corrupt members, their activities hidden from colleagues through careful compartmentalization. The department could move forward with confidence that the cancer had been fully excised. Sarah received the news with relief. The possibility that more of her colleagues might be involved had weighed on her throughout the investigation. Learning that the corruption was limited, contained, eliminated, allowed her to trust her fellow officers once again. Morrison offered additional commendation, suggesting that Sarah might be in line for promotion given her performance. The department needed leaders who combined integrity with courage, who could navigate complex situations without losing their moral compass. Sarah had demonstrated those qualities repeatedly throughout the investigation. Sarah accepted the praise graciously while deflecting toward her team. Marcus had discovered the deleted footage. The tactical officers had executed the building clearance. Morrison herself had coordinated the response, and Max, always Max, had provided the initial discovery that made everything else possible. The captain smiled at this characteristic modesty. That, she said, was exactly why Sarah deserved advancement. Officers who grabbed credit were common. Officers who shared it were rare and valuable. The conversation ended with an understanding that discussions would continue. Sarah returned to her duties with a lighter heart. The burden of the investigation finally lifted. There would be more work, always more work, but it would be the ordinary work of policing rather than the extraordinary burden of rooting out corruption. Max greeted her return with his usual enthusiasm, ready to accompany her wherever duty led. They loaded into the patrol vehicle and headed out into the city, partners facing the day together. The sun was climbing higher now, burning away the morning mist and promising another warm Atlanta day. Sarah drove through familiar streets, eyes scanning for anything that required attention. The radio crackled with routine traffic, dispatchers coordinating the dance of patrol units across the metropolitan area. It was an ordinary day, the kind that made up most of a police career. No dramatic confrontations, no life or death decisions, no moments that would be remembered years later, just the steady, essential work of maintaining order in a complex urban environment. Sarah found satisfaction in that ordinariness. The dramatic cases made headlines and earned commendations, but the routine work was what actually kept the city functioning. Every traffic stop, every welfare check, every response to a minor complaint contributed to the larger fabric of public safety. Max seemed to share her contentment. He rode in his compartment with alert but relaxed attention, watching the world scroll past without the tension that accompanied active operations. His instincts were always ready, always prepared to spring into action. But for now, he could simply enjoy the ride. They stopped for coffee at a cafe that welcomed K-9 units, the owner always happy to provide water for Max and a friendly scratch behind his ears. The simple pleasure of a good cup of coffee in a welcoming environment was one of the small joys that made the job bearable. Sarah sat at an outdoor table, Max resting at her feet, and watched the city move around her. Business people hurrying to meetings, tourists consulting maps, residents going about their daily routines. The ordinary population that officers were sworn to protect and serve. She thought about the case one more time, allowing herself a final moment of reflection before letting it fade into memory. The bodycam footage had vanished from the server, erased by a corrupt officer trying to hide his crimes. But the truth had emerged anyway, carried forward by a dog's alert and a technician's diligence and an officer's persistence. That was how it usually worked, she realized. Criminals thought they could hide their activities, destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, but truth was stubborn. It found ways to surface, to persist, to demand acknowledgement. All that honest people had to do was pay attention, follow the leads, trust their instincts, and trust their partners. Always trust their partners. Max looked up at her, sensing her attention, his tail thumping against the concrete. 7 years of partnership, and he still seemed grateful every day for her presence, her leadership, her affection. The bond between them was beyond price, beyond description, beyond anything she had experienced with any human colleague. She reached down to stroke his head, and he leaned into her touch with evident pleasure. The moment was peaceful, ordinary, precious. The kind of moment that made all the difficult ones worthwhile. The radio interrupted with a call. A suspicious person reported near a school, concerned parents requesting a police presence. Nothing urgent, nothing dangerous, just the routine response to community anxiety. Sarah acknowledged the call and stood, Max rising instantly to accompany her. They returned to the patrol vehicle and headed toward the location. The suspicious person would probably turn out to be nothing, a maintenance worker, or a delivery driver, or someone simply waiting for a ride. But the response was necessary regardless, the visible presence of law enforcement providing reassurance to worried parents. That was the job, not just catching criminals, but making people feel safe, not just solving crimes, but preventing them through presence and vigilance. The work was endless, the demands constant, the satisfaction often intangible, but it was good work, important work. Work that mattered. Sarah and Max arrived at the school and began their assessment. The suspicious person was indeed a maintenance worker, his van clearly marked with a company logo that the reporting party had somehow missed. Sarah spoke with the worker, verified his credentials, and radioed the all clear. The concerned parent apologized for the false alarm. Sarah assured her that calling was the right decision, that vigilance was valuable even when it produced false positives. Better to investigate 100 innocent people than to miss one genuine threat. They returned to patrol, the incident already fading from memory. Another call answered, another community reassured, another small contribution to the larger mission of public safety. The day continued in similar fashion, hours passing in a blur of routine activity, minor calls, brief interactions, the endless rhythm of police work. Sarah moved through it with practiced efficiency, Max always at her side, their partnership as seamless as ever. By the time the shift ended, the sun was descending toward the western horizon, painting the Atlanta skyline in shades of orange and purple. Sarah completed her paperwork, logged off her equipment, and prepared to head home. Max was tired but content, the satisfied exhaustion of a working dog who had done his duty. He followed Sarah to her personal vehicle and settled into his spot with a deep sigh. She drove through the evening traffic, the city's lights beginning to sparkle as darkness approached. Another day complete, another shift concluded, Another page turned in the endless story of a police officer and her K-9 partner. The bodycam footage had vanished from the server, but what it had captured lived on, in the arrests that had been made, the evidence that had been preserved, the justice that was being served, in the lessons learned and the partnership strengthened and the corruption exposed, and in the memory of a routine warehouse inspection that became something extraordinary. A moment when a dog's instinct and an officer's integrity combined to make a difference that mattered. Sarah pulled into her driveway and let Max out into the backyard. He explored his territory with his usual thoroughness, then settled beneath the oak tree to watch the stars emerge. She sat on the porch with a glass of water and let the peace of the evening wash over her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities. But tonight she could rest. The case was closed. The truth had emerged. Justice was being served. And the lieutenant and her K-9 partner had done their part to make it happen. That was enough. That would always be enough.